Marble floors gleamed beneath the flicker of golden lamps. Domes inlaid with precious stones stretched toward the heavens, their brilliance reflecting the might of an empire that once ruled 3 continents. Silk curtains swayed gently in the Istanbul breeze, carrying the scent of roses from the palace gardens. To the outsider, Topkapi was the jewel of the Ottoman world, an earthly paradise built to display the Sultan's unrivaled power. But step beyond the gilded gates and the grandeur transforms into something far darker. For behind the marble walls and jeweled ceilings was a labyrinth of silence. A world not of paradise, but of control. A place where the Sultan, exalted publicly as the shadow of God on earth, maintained a secret court of souls who were never meant to be seen. The boy concubines. They arrived here stripped of names, pasts, and innocence. To the world outside, they did not exist. Within the palace, they were property, destined to serve, to obey, to entertain. The more magnificent the halls appeared, the more suffocating their reality became. The same silk curtains that whispered with opulence also concealed 1,000 muffled cries. The Ottomans celebrated Topkapi as the beating heart of an empire that commanded fear and awe from Europe to Arabia. Visitors marveled at the fountains of alabaster, the calligraphy etched in gold, the endless procession of servants who moved like clockwork in reverence to their sovereign. Yet for the enslaved boys locked within, every shining surface became a mirror of their captivity. Here, cruelty was not loud. It was elegant, refined, almost ritualistic. A boy's laughter was a crime, his tears an act of disobedience. The palace trained him to erase every trace of humanity until nothing remained but a vessel of service. Those who failed faced consequences whispered of, but rarely witnessed. Vanishings in the night, sudden silences that were never explained. And the Sultan? He was worshipped as infallible, a living symbol of divine will. His public image was one of majesty, justice, and unmatched generosity. But the same man who handed out gold to loyal subjects presided over chambers where innocence was consumed for pleasure, where loyalty was tested not by devotion to empire, but by submission to power. This contrast was the essence of Topkapi. On the surface, a masterpiece of civilization. Beneath, a gilded cage where human souls were bent and broken in service of one man's will. To stand in those chambers today is to feel an unsettling duality. The walls shimmer with history's glory, yet they echo with what history has tried to bury. The secret lives of boys who were forced to surrender everything, even the right to grow into men. The empire celebrated victory, wealth, and divine order. But hidden within its golden palace was a silence so profound it threatened to drown the echoes of conquest. And it is here, in this silence, that our story begins. The story of a boy concubine never began in the palace. It began in the quiet corners of distant villages, places where life was simple, where the sound of church bells or shepherds' songs marked the passing of days. These were Christian lands under Ottoman rule, the Balkans, Anatolia, parts of Eastern Europe. For families, the greatest terror was not war, but the knock at the door when soldiers arrived to collect what the empire called tribute in blood. This was the dev-shurme system. Officially, it was presented as an opportunity, a way for the Sultan to gather the strongest and brightest of his subjects. In truth, it was a calculated abduction. Young boys, sometimes no older than 8 or 9, were taken from their mothers' arms. The wails of parents echoed through valleys, powerless to resist the empire's demand. To refuse was treason. To resist was death. For the boys, the journey began with confusion. They were herded into groups, their clothes replaced, their names written down in records. They did not know it yet, but the empire was already erasing them. No longer sons, no longer villagers, no longer Christian. They became blank pages upon which the Sultan would write his will. The forced march to Istanbul was grueling. Some boys fell sick and never arrived. Others clung to memories of home, the warmth of a mother's embrace, the sound of laughter with siblings, the scent of bread baking in clay ovens. But as days turned into weeks, those memories blurred. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear stripped them of the last fragments of childhood. When they finally saw the skyline of Istanbul, with its domes and minarets rising like giants against the horizon, awe mixed with terror. They were entering a world they could not comprehend. For them, the palace was not a marvel of architecture, it was a gate into captivity. The first ritual of their new life was the most cruel: conversion. Baptized as Christians, they were forced to renounce their faith and embrace Islam. The empire called this salvation. For the boys, it was a burial. Their old names were replaced with Turkish ones. Their mother tongue was forbidden. To speak it meant punishment. They were ordered to forget who they had been, as if a child could erase the very language in which his mother had once whispered lullabies. Then came the breaking. Some were trained as soldiers in the Janissary Corps, but the most vulnerable, the most physically appealing, were directed elsewhere, toward the palace harem. Here, their bodies were not weapons of war, but instruments of pleasure. Every step in their training was designed to strip away resistance. Smiles were discouraged. Laughter was beaten out of them. A boy who once ran free in meadows now walked with downcast eyes, his innocence replaced with silence. Obedience was survival. Disobedience was unthinkable. Guards watched every movement. Older concubines, themselves broken long ago, enforced the rules with cruelty born of fear. A misplaced glance, a whispered word, a refusal to bow. Any could lead to punishment so swift and brutal that the lesson would carve itself into memory forever. The transformation was complete when the boys themselves forgot what it felt like to be children. They learned to move like shadows, to smile when commanded, to remain still when every part of them wanted to run. The palace called it refinement. History reveals it as psychological annihilation. By the time the Sultan summoned them, the boys were no longer boys. They were masks, faces that concealed the echo of stolen laughter, the ghosts of families they would never see again. This was how innocence was captured, reshaped, and consumed. Not in one act of violence, but through a slow, methodical breaking. A process so thorough that, in the end, the boy who had once lived in a sunlit village existed only as a memory the palace tried to erase. For centuries, whispers of the Sultan's harem captivated the imagination of Europe. Painters, travelers, and poets described it as a paradise of forbidden beauty, a place where veiled women danced, where fountains spilled into marble basins, where the Sultan reclined on cushions of silk surrounded by his chosen companions. To the outside world, the harem was a theatre of pleasure, a fantasy of indulgence. But inside the palace walls, reality was far more complex and far more disturbing. The harem was not merely a sanctuary of women, it was a carefully constructed system of control, a labyrinth where politics, desire, and fear intertwined. And within this labyrinth lived not only wives and concubines, but boys, enslaved children moulded to serve in ways the world beyond those gates could scarcely imagine. Life inside began with rules. Every breath, every glance, every movement was governed by protocol. The harem was built not only to contain bodies, but to break spirits. Boys were trained to walk silently, to bow deeply, to never meet the gaze of those above them. The grandeur of their surroundings, the mosaics glittering like stars, the air heavy with perfumes of musk and jasmine, only heightened the cruelty of their confinement. The beauty of the harem was a mask for its brutality. From dawn until nightfall, routines dictated existence. They were washed, perfumed, and dressed in robes finer than anything they had ever known. But these garments, soft as they were, did not bring comfort. They were uniforms of submission, reminders that even luxury could be another form of chains. Training was relentless. They were taught music, plucking strings on the oud, coaxing melodies from flutes that carried through echoing chambers. They learned the art of dance, movements choreographed not for self-expression, but for the pleasure of those who watched. Their bodies became instruments of entertainment, their gestures rehearsed, their smiles rehearsed, their very identities rehearsed until nothing remained authentic. But beyond performance lay something darker. The boys were taught the subtleties of seduction, not openly, but through careful suggestion, through the way an elder might instruct them to move, to lower their eyes, to anticipate desires unspoken. This was not education in culture or refinement. It was grooming, an initiation into roles they never chose. The harem's duality was suffocating. Feasts were prepared with jeweled plates, and music drifted through courtyards scented with rosewater. Yet the same walls that witnessed opulence also witnessed silent suffering. A boy might sip sherbet sweetened with honey in the afternoon, then cry himself to sleep at night, clutching a memory of home fading with each passing day. Surveillance was constant. Eunuchs patrolled the halls, their very presence a reminder that disobedience would not be tolerated. Some eunuchs, themselves victims of cruelty, enforced order with harshness that came from their own brokenness. Others turned a blind eye, knowing the price of compassion was often their own punishment. For the boys, there was no space free from watchful eyes. Even in their most private moments, they belonged not to themselves, but to the Sultan. To survive, many perfected the art of masks. They smiled when they wanted to weep. They played music when their hearts screamed for silence. They obeyed when every instinct told them to resist. Over time, the mask became the face, and the boy became the role the palace demanded of him. Outside, the empire thrived on conquest, trade, and glory. Inside, its power was sustained by a hidden theatre where children were forced to perform roles in a story that was never theirs to tell. The world saw only the glittering curtain, the fantasies painted in travelogues and whispered in salons. Few ever glimpsed the truth that lay behind it, a prison disguised as paradise. In the end, the harem was less a home of pleasure than a machine of control. It consumed innocence and dressed its remains in silk and gold. It was the empire in miniature, a dazzling facade concealing the suffering of the powerless beneath the shadow of absolute rule. At the heart of Topkapi Palace, beyond the jeweled corridors and perfumed chambers, lay the darkest truth of all. The Sultan, exalted by subjects as God's vicegerent on earth, wielded power so absolute that even the bodies and souls of children bent to his will. To the outside world, he was a just ruler, a guardian of faith and empire. But within the palace, he was something else entirely, an unchallengeable force before whom innocence crumbled. For the boys of the harem, their ultimate purpose was not service in music, nor dance, nor the etiquette of court. It was obedience to the Sultan's desires. Each evening, when shadows stretched long across the Bosporus, whispers filled the corridors. Who would be summoned tonight? The summons was both an honor and a curse. To be chosen meant survival, proximity to the throne, perhaps even favor. But it also meant surrendering to rituals that left scars far deeper than any lash. Accounts from travelers and court insiders, though often veiled in secrecy, spoke of loyalty tests. The language was clinical, but the reality was intimate exploitation. A boy's silence, his ability to endure without resistance, was read as proof of loyalty. Fear and submission were mistaken for devotion. To resist was unthinkable. Resistance could mean disappearance, swallowed by the same palace walls that had consumed countless others. For the Sultan, this ritualized exploitation reinforced his supremacy. Each encounter reminded the boys that their lives, their bodies, even their breath, belonged entirely to him. It was not just indulgence, it was domination, the ultimate performance of absolute power. And yet, in these silent chambers, the Sultan himself was also a prisoner of tradition, trapped within a cycle of cruelty handed down as a mark of sovereignty. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Boys who once dreamed of home learned instead to dream of survival. Some disassociated, retreating into silence so complete that their emotions seemed erased. Others internalized the rituals, convincing themselves it was destiny, that perhaps God himself had willed it so. In this way, the palace not only exploited bodies, but also conquered minds. And then there were the rumors, dark tales whispered of rituals that blurred the line between ceremony and cruelty. Nights when the Sultan tested the loyalty of multiple boys at once. Nights when gifts of jewels or silken robes followed acts of submission. To outsiders, these accounts were scandalous gossip, often dismissed as exaggeration. Yet for the boys within, the scars were undeniable. Whether or not every story was true, the suffering was real, lived in silence and buried in fear. The contradiction was staggering. The same Sultan who bowed in prayer 5 times a day, who presided over grand councils of state, also presided over chambers where the powerless were consumed. This duality was the shadow that loomed over the empire itself, glorious in conquest, yet rotten in secrecy. History records victories, laws, monuments, and reforms. Rarely does it record the trembling of a child summoned in the night or the whispered prayers of a boy begging for release. Yet it is in these shadows that the true cost of empire is revealed. Absolute power did not simply build palaces, it demanded sacrifices. And in the Ottoman court, those sacrifices were the lives and innocence of countless children, remembered today only as echoes in gilded halls. Within the palace, survival was an art form as complex as any battle waged on distant fields. The boys who endured the Sultan's shadow often discovered that their lives were not only shaped by pleasure and servitude, but also by politics. For some, submission alone was not enough. To live, they had to learn how to maneuver within a system that thrived on betrayal. Whispers became currency. A boy who carried information between chambers could buy himself favor. Some became the Sultan's confidants, their ears trained to capture secrets, their tongues sharpened to deliver them at the right moment. In a palace where suspicion ruled, even a child could become a weapon, a spy in silken robes. And yet, the price of miscalculation was death. Those who failed to please, or whose usefulness waned, were discarded like broken instruments. Some were exiled quietly, vanishing into the empire's endless provinces. Others met darker fates, mutilated to ensure they would never father heirs, or executed to silence them forever. But there were rare stories of ascension. A handful of concubines, hardened by suffering, climbed the treacherous ladder of influence. They learned to exploit rivalries, to play factions against one another, to whisper in the right ear at the right time. These few transformed their captivity into power, shaping decisions that rippled across the empire. Their survival was proof of resilience, but also a reminder of how cruelty forced even children into games meant for rulers. For the vast majority, however, the story ended in silence. Thousands passed through the gilded halls and were swallowed by history, their names erased, their lives reduced to footnotes, if they were remembered at all. Their suffering was the cost of sustaining an empire's grandeur, their innocence a currency exchanged for the illusion of divine power. The harem consumed them as surely as wars consumed soldiers. And in the end, the fragile thrones they built for themselves, whether of favor, survival, or whispered influence, were as unstable as the shifting sands of palace intrigue. One wrong move, one jealous rival, one flicker of the Sultan's displeasure, and everything collapsed. In this cruel theatre of power, survival was possible, but never secure. Today, Topkapi Palace stands as a monument of Ottoman glory. Tourists wander its glittering halls, marvel at jewelled thrones, and gaze at the view over the Bosporus. Few pause to wonder what shadows linger in its silence. The marble floors, polished by centuries of footsteps, once carried children who were never meant to leave. The golden domes that inspire awe once hid cries that history has buried. The story of the boy concubines rarely finds a place in official records. It survives in fragments, in whispers, in rumours that empires tried to erase. Yet their absence speaks louder than words. For every tale of victory carved into stone, there are countless unnamed lives consumed by power's hunger. Their legacy is not written in monuments, but in silence. The silence of boys who never grew old, whose laughter was stolen, whose innocence was reshaped into obedience. The palace remains a cage, its beauty inseparable from the cruelty it concealed. And so, we are left with a haunting truth. Empires are remembered for their grandeur, but their shadows are built upon the suffering of the voiceless. Behind every golden curtain lies a price, paid in lives the world chose to forget.